Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies, defenddemocracy.org, counterterrorism expert and friend of the show, David Gartenstein-Ross. It is fantastic to speak to you, sir.
John, it's always great to join you.
All right, let's get right to it. I don't want to waste any time. There's been a question that's been bugging me. This is going to be a little broad before we get into some specific news about ISIS. But there's a movie trope where you have the advisors around a presidential administration are never the smartest guys. It's always the guys on the outside of the administration, the experts that are always smarter than the people surrounding the presidency. And I guess that would put you in the smarter guys outside of the administration sort of category. But is there a reality to that? Who advises the president when it comes to matters like ISIS, Al-Qaeda? And are those, generally speaking, the smartest people to be advising the president on those issues?
There's a reality to that. There's a reality to that movie trope. And the reason why is what allows someone to advance within government up until the point that they're advising a president is being a good politician. You know, politics plays a very big role, and being a good politician isn't necessarily the same as being a good analyst or actually having a good practical solution to some of these problems. That being said, generally the people who are surrounding the president, they may not be the smartest guys in the room, but they're usually the most well-informed guys in the room. Given the classification of data and all the segmentation of classified data, they usually have a lot more pertinent information than other people do. They don't always interpret it the right way, but they certainly have enough information to be able to shoot down people who don't agree with their viewpoint.
I was reading last week an article, and it was basically saying that ISIS was stronger now and a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda, and they were pointing to some data about the Khorasan group. I wanted to get your general assessment of where ISIS is right now, and ask you that question because it's been a long time since we've talked. Is ISIS a bigger threat to the United States of America than Al-Qaeda is, or is that really coming down to it depends on what type of threat we're talking about?
I'd say it comes down to what kind of threat we're talking about, but I mean the bigger picture view is that this isn't particularly good news, right? If this were true, that ISIS poses a bigger threat, that's terrible news because those are two different threat streams now. It's not as though the Al-Qaeda threat stream has gone away. That threat stream exists, and now you have a new threat that comes on top of that. Now, there's discussion about whether ISIS has basically supplanted Al-Qaeda, made Al-Qaeda irrelevant. I think the answer to that is very clearly no. There's a lot to be said about ISIS, and I think right now we're really only scratching the surface as to the future of the organization. I think it could, there's a chance that it's in more trouble than people understand, because if you look at some of its losses of late, they've been below the radar, but it's consistently been having its logistical routes being cut into. That being said, the organization may be of such a scale and facing opponents who have themselves been so ineffective at governance and ineffective at serving the Sunni population in Iraq and Syria that these losses don't matter, that they prove to be ephemeral, and that ISIS can just barrel through them. But what's happened with respect to ISIS, regardless of its specific fate, is something that other violent non-state actors are watching. I mean, they've shown that even with the most powerful states in the world trying to push back a group like ISIS, it's been able to continue to govern territory for well over a year, and it still is able to mount offensives on at least two different fronts. Other non-state actors are definitely watching this, and the next one to come around may not make as many stakes as ISIS has in terms of ISIS's penchant to make enemies on all sides and fight wars not just on two fronts but on 8 different fronts at once.
What's the latest coming out of Iraq? We haven't heard, I couldn't tell you the last time I heard any kind of update, in the mainstream media or elsewhere of our efforts to push ISIS back in Iraq. Is it sort of been status quo for a while, or do they continue to make advances?
They haven't been making advances since Ramadi fell back in May. That's been the most significant gain. Since then, they've been trying to solidify their grasp over the rest of Anbar province and have been steadily gaining in on all the territory that they don't hold. But Excuse me. But at the same time, Iranian-backed forces have been making some advances on ISIS. They've recently captured Anbar University near Ramadi. And essentially, I mean, this is not good news for the United States, that Iran has basically been conducting counterinsurgency and trying to embed itself as a permanent presence within Iraq. And for the first time, especially due to the U.S.'s decision not to engage at a sub-state level, not to engage with the Sunni tribes that were so important to defeating ISIS's predecessor back in the 2007 to 08 period, they instead have been looking to Iran as an entity that they may not like. There are sectarian differences, but at the very least, it's one that's going to come through on its promises to fight against ISIS.
Talking with David Gartenstein-Ross, defenddemocracy.org. Circling back to the administration, a couple of different comments from two different individuals, one from Attorney General Loretta Lynch. The other that we'll start with was the Defense Secretary Ash Carter. Over the weekend, said there was no doubt the Islamic State ultimately will be defeated, but the bigger question is whether that will lead to a lasting peace. We will win, but the important thing is to win and make it stick. Is that even logical? I mean, can you defeat ISIS? I mean, I don't even know. I mean, what would that mean or entail?
I think there are different things that people could mean when they say that. I mean, the answer. Let me give a straight answer though. That yes, it does make sense. There is actually a distinct meaning. And whether this is possible at this point, I think one can question. But essentially, defeat would be to push back their territorial gains and to have their territorial losses be not just at the hands of the Shia-led Iraqi state and Iran, but also to have localized resistance and people standing up to ISIS. And that the images of localized resistance, similar to these images in the 2007 to 08 period, when ISIS's predecessor was so powerful in Anbar province, are indicative to people, they're symbolic to people, of ISIS having massively overplayed its hand and sparked a backlash against its rule. If that happens, then it's possible that ISIS's brand could end up being toxic, that essentially they've overplayed their hand so much that they have little ability to regenerate their brand, that people turn against them. That would be a crushing defeat. Short of that, another thing that I think would constitute a legitimate defeat is them not to be able to hold their territorial holdings, Raqqa, Mosul, etc. If they lose those major holdings, then they'll still exist as an organization, but they won't be what people are talking about now, which is an entity that for all intents and purposes functions as a state does. Either of those, I think, would constitute a defeat, and I think that both of those are possible with the slow grind of them losing their territory, but not quite all of it, not becoming toxic, being the more realistic one right now.
You couldn't say the same thing, though. Well, you tell me. But I mean, I guess based off of what you've said in our conversations throughout the years, it would seem to me you couldn't say the same thing about an organization or a group like Al Qaeda, but then they are operating differently than ISIS, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And look, ISIS could also go the Al Qaeda route, and if it starts to experience major losses, it could retreat into being much more of a covert organization and a clandestine network, which would make it hard to completely squelch out. Those organizations, once in a while, one of them will lose. A good example is the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, which is an organization, a militant organization based in Sri Lanka, comprised of Tamil separatists. That was a very powerful group that fought a very bloody civil war for over 20 years against the Sri Lankan government. And among other things, it had its own nascent air force. It also, like ISIS, governed territory, and it was a very brutal organization, though it pales in comparison to ISIS in that regard. They eventually were met with a crushing defeat, and they have not rebounded as an organization since that happened, since 2009. So sometimes that happens. But for clandestine networks that span across multiple countries, and LTTE had a support network that spanned the globe. It went all the way into Canada, where LTTE was a very powerful force on the ground within the Tamil community. And such organizations are difficult to defeat. Sometimes they do lose, but one has to be very careful in kind of calibrating what defeat is in that regard.
Again, speaking with David Gartenstein-Ross, Attorney General Loretta Lynch over the weekend said a cyber attack by the Islamic State is perhaps the terror group's biggest emerging threat, and that it keeps her up at night. Do you think it's keeping her up at night? And if it is, should it?
You see, when a little bit of a leading question.
Yeah, I realize that. That's why I'm laughing.
Is they've been very, very creative. Right? They've been very creative in that, when the Arab Spring occurred and people were mobilizing against dictatorships, what they showed was the ability of social media to really serve as a mobilizing force.
Right.
And I warned at the time that, bad guys can use this as well. But ISIS exceeded even my expectations in terms of its mastery of Twitter as a domain and its ability to really forge relationships with people half a globe away and get them to mobilize to action. ISIS was very good at that, and more people have been mobilized to the Iraq-Syria theater by far than went to Afghanistan as foreign fighters during the Afghan-Soviet War. You've had over 25,000 foreigners go to Syria and Iraq to fight for militant organizations. Now, that's one example. Another example of their creativity is, I'm not sure if your listeners followed this, but they posted identifying contact information of 100 members of the U.S. Armed Services, including their photographs, their addresses, information about their family, basically a target list, which is a remarkable thing. Now, thankfully, no one was killed who was on that list. But if you think of the disruptive effect of having basically all the information about your life being dumped onto the web by ISIS, that is a striking thing to do. And that wasn't based on a hack. They just gleaned that information from what people were posting on social media. There's a lot that ISIS could do with a cyber attack in multiple ways. I mean, we could think of it in the science fiction way of like ISIS mounting a cyber attack that shuts down Los Angeles, and
sure.
But instead, it's the more kind of disruptive attack that can destroy several people's lives and have a ripple effect across an organization that I think would do a lot of damage. And that's probably the kind of thing that she says keeps her up at night.
All right, one more question real quick, David, before we let you go this morning. Are we talking about the right thing? I mean, we've had this discussion mostly about ISIS this morning. Is this where the attention should be right now when you're looking at, threats to the United States of America, or should we be looking somewhere else?
Yeah, I think the thing we should be talking about that very few people are is whether the GOP primary should be held as a game show.
Well, I had this Lazy Susan idea, or maybe people that keep coming back to me with a bracket. And I kind of like the bracket idea, but I don't really know how to work out the mathematics on it yet.
There's 16 candidates right now, right?
Well, there's more than that. That's the problem, too.
So you'd have like a play-in round.
Right.
Right, then you get it to the bracket. That's easy.
Yeah,
Obviously.
Well, I mentioned it to the powers that be here, but then I was, I don't know much about, March Madness and NCAA basketball, but apparently there's math involved in it, and they don't know how to make the math work when it comes to GOP candidates yet, so I'll have to leave that to the webmasters and the IT guys to try to figure out, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, keep me in the loop, because I think there's no more pressing issue right now than whether the GOP primary can be made into a game show.
Trump's well on his way to making that happen all by himself. David Gartenstein-Ross, senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. It has been entirely too long. I put that on my shoulders, sir, but it was great to talk to you again this morning. I appreciate the insight and the time.
Always a pleasure, John. You take care.
More coming up on the Jon Justice Show. It's 104.1 KQTH, Tucson's News and Talk.